Ever wonder if we're getting a whole truth in a courtroom? Today, we're really diving deep into a case that'll make you question exactly that.
Buckle up.
We're looking at a Nathan Medina story.
Yeah.
He's currently incarcerated, and he's alleging some serious corruption within the police and the courts, ultimately leading to what he claims is a wrongful conviction.
Right, and we're going straight to the source, taking a close look at a report he self-published from prison.
Exactly. So we can really unpack his arguments. And now remember, our goal here is to understand his perspective and analyze the arguments he's presenting, not to pass judgment or say whether he's right or wrong.
It's about his viewpoint.
Okay, so we're trying to get inside his head a little and understand his side of the story. And let me tell you, the way he lays everything out in this report, it reads like a legal thriller. You've got alleged cover-ups, issues with witness testimonies, even a juror that seemingly disappears. It's got all the makings of a true crime documentary.
All the elements, yeah. So to understand the gravity of Medina's claims, let's go back to the start, back to 2008. A tragic incident unfolds in Walnut Creek, California, a home invasion and shooting with multiple victims. Medina quickly becomes the prime suspect.
Right.
And this is where his report really kicks in, claiming that pretty much every step of the process, the investigation, the trial, everything was mishandled. And he claims that this mishandling raises huge questions about how this case was decided and his ultimate conviction.
And the interesting thing here is that he doesn't just make these claims, right?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't just say, oh, this was mishandled, and leave it at that. He backs it up, and he backs it up with actual excerpts from the trial transcripts, from police reports, even personal letters he's kept. We're talking about a paper trail here.
Which is unusual, to say the least. It's not every day someone goes to these lengths to make their case.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it seems like he's making a real effort to say, look, this is about transparency. I'm giving you the evidence, the public, so you can see it from my perspective,
Yeah.
Direct connection.
And listeners, get this. The heart of this case, it all hinges on eyewitness identification. Medina says that in the recording of the police's very first interview with a key witness, that witness explicitly states they couldn't see the attacker clearly. But then, at the trial, this same witness confidently identifies Medina as the attacker.
Okay, so he's saying there are inconsistencies in the witness testimony.
Exactly. Huge inconsistencies, right? And then it gets worse. He claims he was denied access to those crucial recordings, the very recordings that could have helped him challenge those inconsistencies during the trial.
Which makes you wonder, how do you even begin to prepare a defense when you don't have all the pieces?
Exactly. And then there's that mysterious missing juror. You know I mentioned that, right?
Right.
Medina claims this juror, this is while the trial was going on, started asking really specific, pointed questions about the case. And guess what? This juror even asked for those recordings that Medina was after, the same ones he was denied.
Juror number 8, he calls him.
Right, juror number 8. And what happens? This juror is suddenly dismissed from the case and replaced. And you know what else? That whole line of questioning, those pointed questions, they just vanish. Poof, gone.
Interesting.
It's like, did anyone else notice this? And this is just one example, listeners. It really makes you wonder, what if? What if that juror had stayed on? How would that have impacted the trial's outcome?
Yeah, it makes you think about how these seemingly small details can have a huge ripple effect.
Absolutely. And Medina argues that if those recordings, those same recordings that the juror was asking about, if they had been played for the jury, it could change everything.
Yeah.
He says it could have created enough reasonable doubt to change the outcome.
Because if the jury's not sure, they can't convict, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And Medina claims that not having those recordings to work with, paired with what he believes was, well, less than stellar legal team representing him, is what ultimately led to that guilty verdict.
So he's suggesting a perfect storm of factors all working against him.
Right, like a domino effect.
Right.
So to really understand what went down, we need to rewind, go back to March 20, 2008, the day this all went down, the day of the crime. Medina meticulously lays out this minute-by-minute timeline of the events, starting with those crucial 911 calls.
And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because he claims that by closely examining the timeline and those initial reports, a different story starts to emerge. One where the police, in his view, were maybe a little too quick to jump to conclusions, even if it meant overlooking or downplaying anything that didn't fit the narrative they were building.
And he really hones in on that very first 911 call. the one made by Beverly Rhoads, one of the victims in this case. He calls it absolutely crucial to understanding what he believes are these huge discrepancies in the entire investigation.
Right, because that first call, those first few minutes, are chaos, right? Adrenaline's pumping, it's happening so fast, people might not even be totally sure what they saw.
Absolutely. And he claims that in this first call, moments after the attack, Rhoads tells the operator Nathan Medina shot her son. But then, and here's the twist, Medina claims that the actual recording of that 911 call doesn't actually say that. He's made the recording public, and according to him, Rhoads doesn't clearly identify her attacker on the call.
So he's saying there's a discrepancy between what was reported and what the recording actually says.
Exactly. It's a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's saying the police ran with that name, Nathan Medina, even though, from his perspective, the actual 911 call doesn't back that up.
It's like the game of telephone, you know? The story changes as it's passed along.
And this is just the beginning, right? There's
Yeah.
another witness we need to talk about, Sean Mendel, who was there during the attack. We'll get into his account and what it reveals next.
It really makes you think twice, about how these media stories get spun and how they can really shape what people think, even in a serious case like this.
Absolutely, and we haven't even gotten to the trial yet. Medina says the trial itself was a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, and remember, we're looking at this from Medina's point of view.
Right.
He claims these issues, along with what he felt was, let's say, less than ideal legal representation, really hurt his chances with the jury.
So listeners, put yourself in his shoes for a second. He's saying his own lawyer wasn't doing what he should have been doing to fight for him. So what's he actually alleging?
He goes so far as to say his attorney, who he just calls counsel throughout the report, seemed more worried about, well, his own image than actually trying to prove his innocence.
Wow.
Which, I mean, if true, is a pretty serious accusation to make.
That's a huge accusation. Okay, let's unpack these claims. So Medina alleges his attorney just didn't use some pretty important evidence, stuff that could have made the jury really question the prosecution's case. Like, remember that big leather jacket, the 3XL one?
Right, the one the police took from his place.
Yeah, the one that Mendel and Longfellow, the other witness, said they saw.
Right.
So this jacket, it becomes a big deal in Medina's story.
It does.
He says it could have helped prove he wasn't the guy.
Interesting. How so?
Well, he claims that because the attack was so violent, if he had been the attacker, that jacket would be covered in blood, pepper spray, you name it.
That makes sense, right? I mean, if he's involved in a brutal attack like that, there's got to be something on his clothes.
Exactly. And get this, according to Medina, no blood, no pepper spray, nothing like that was ever found on that jacket.
Okay, but couldn't it have been cleaned?
That's what I thought, right? But Medina says that even the prosecution's own expert, the blood splatter expert they brought in, even he testified that there's just no way, given how the attack happened, that the attacker could have gotten away without getting blood all over themselves.
So he's saying that this expert testimony, along with the fact that there's no physical evidence connecting him to the scene, should have raised some eyebrows with the jury.
Exactly. And hold on, because it doesn't stop there. Medina also claims that his lawyer, get this, didn't even bring in any of his own experts to counter what the prosecution was saying.
So he's saying his lawyer basically missed opportunities to poke holes in the prosecution's case.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Okay, so what was his lawyer's plan then?
Well, according to Medina, instead of going head-to-head with the prosecution, his lawyer was trying to find these little inconsistencies, hoping for a mistrial. Like maybe the jury would just say, well, we're not sure.
Hoping for that reasonable doubt.
Right, exactly.
But if I'm following you, it sounds like that didn't exactly pan out.
Nope, it didn't. And Medina says that because his lawyer wasn't aggressive enough, the prosecution's story ended up being the only story the jury really heard.
So he's saying his defense was almost non-existent, that his lawyer basically let the prosecution run the show.
That's exactly how he sees it. And to make matters worse, he says the prosecution used what he calls junk science to convince the jury he was guilty.
Junk science? What does he mean by that?
He's talking about this tool mark analysis they did on the ammunition that they found at his place.
Oh, okay.
They said that the markings on those bullets matched up perfectly with the markings on the bullets from the crime scene. Like they came from the exact same batch of ammo.
Okay, so at first glance, that sounds like pretty strong evidence.
Right.
Right.
But get this, tool mark analysis. It turns out it's not as foolproof as those crime shows make it seem.
Really?
There was this huge report from the National Academy of Sciences that said there are some serious problems with how reliable it actually is.
So you're saying this type of analysis isn't as cut and dry as they make it seem on TV?
Exactly. The report basically said there's just not enough scientific evidence to say for sure that a bullet came from a specific gun based on those little markings. Like, it's way less accurate than most people think.
Huh.
So Medina's saying, right, that the prosecution, they presented this iffy evidence as if it was fact, and his own lawyer, well, he didn't really do much to challenge it.
Okay, so that's a big deal, but it gets even more complicated, right? Because Medina then claims that his lawyer actually told him to say something on the stand that might have helped the prosecution.
Yeah, hold on. You're telling me Medina's own lawyer told him to say stuff that might have made him look guilty. How does that even happen?
Well, Medina says his lawyer told him to tell the jury that he had dry fired, like pulling the trigger without a bullet, the ammo in question, while he was showing his fiancée how to use a gun.
But wouldn't that, like, raise more questions than it answers? It seems super risky.
Yeah, it does,
Yeah.
right. And Medina says that at the time, he trusted his lawyer's advice. I mean, that's your lawyer, right?
Right.
But looking back, he thinks that testifying like that was a mistake.
So he's basically saying his own lawyer's decisions might have actually led to that guilty verdict.
Which is a tough pill to swallow, right?
Yeah.
The idea that the person who's supposed to be in your corner could be the one who makes things worse.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about that missing juror we keep talking about, juror number 8.
Right.
Medina says this juror got dismissed from the jury right when they started asking some tough questions about the evidence, especially about those missing recordings.
Right, those recordings keep coming up.
It's almost like he knew.
Yeah,
It's a crucial detail in all of this.
it is.
It's hard to even imagine being in his position, facing these charges, and feeling like everyone and everything is against you.
It's like the walls are closing in.
Exactly. It really makes you stop and think about how our justice system works, or maybe how it doesn't work sometimes. Like, shouldn't everyone have a fair shot, a fair trial?
Absolutely.
And, this whole thing with the recordings, it really underscores how important it is to have all the facts, all the information on the table.
Transparency is key, right?
Exactly.
And for Medina, that lack of transparency, it became a huge roadblock in his fight to clear his name after the trial. And honestly, this part of his story, it's almost harder to believe than what happened during the trial.
It's just wild to me, that those recordings were just missing, just gone for so long.
Yeah.
You can't help but wonder what's on them, how they could have changed things at the trial.
Yeah.
Makes you think about how important it is to have all the pieces of the puzzle when it comes to justice, wouldn't you say?
It really highlights that need for transparency, for everyone to be playing with the same deck of cards in the justice system. And Medina says that lack of transparency, it became this massive hurdle for him when he was trying to clear his name after he was convicted. And this part of his story, honestly, it's almost harder to believe than what he says went down at the trial itself.
What's crazier than alleged witness tampering and hidden evidence?
Right. Well, Medina says there was this whole effort to keep him quiet, to bury the very evidence he thought could prove he was innocent, those recordings we've been talking about. And he goes into a lot of detail about just how hard he tried to get his hands on them.
Sounds like he was on a mission, and not an easy one.
He talks about years of filing motions, serving subpoenas, just navigating this maze of bureaucracy. He really thinks it was all designed to keep those recordings under wraps.
So he's fighting the system from the inside, trying to uncover the truth, at least his truth. Did he ever get those recordings?
He says his own attorney in the prosecutor's office, they both kept denying him access, giving him different reasons every time. Reasons that Medina says were total BS.
So they're basically giving him the runaround.
Yeah, pretty much. He even claims that his attorney told him at one point that the DA's office was saying they had some kind of copyright over the recordings. Copyright.
You're kidding me. Copyright on evidence in a criminal case.
It sounds crazy, right?
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Medina even points out how absurd that is in his report. It's like every time he turned around, there was another wall in his way.
A classic David versus Goliath situation.
Totally.
Except David's the one stuck in prison.
Right, exactly.
So what happened? Did this whole back and forth with the recordings ever go anywhere?
Okay, so this is where things take a really, really strange turn. Remember Beverly Rhoads, the victim who pointed the finger at Medina in that first 911 call?
Right.
She ends up filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Medina and his family.
Hold on. The victim sues the guy she said did it, even though he's already locked up. What was the reason for that?
It's a weird twist, for sure. But get this civil suit, it ends up being the key to Medina finally getting his hands on those recordings. During that lawsuit, the insurance company, the one representing Medina's family, they managed to get copies of some of those recordings.
Are you serious? After all that, after years of being told no, those recordings pop up in a civil case.
It's a crazy coincidence, right? But it gets even wilder. Medina says those recordings, they completely contradict the story that landed him in prison in the first place. He even puts excerpts from the transcripts in his report, highlighting the parts he says don't match up with what people said at his trial.
Like, what? Give me an example. What's in those recordings?
So, for example, he points to a part where Rhoads, in her interview with the police, she says over and over that the attacker was wearing a mask. But at the trial, she said she saw Medina's face clear as day, remember?
Wow. That's a pretty big difference.
Right.
Are there other examples like that on those recordings?
Yeah, there are. Like, there's another part where Mendel, the other witness, he describes the guy who attacked them as having this shriveled up face.
Hmm.
And like we talked about before, that description, it doesn't really sound like Medina at all.
So he's saying that these recordings, the ones they kept from him, they actually back up his side of the story.
That's exactly what he's saying. Now, we have to remember, right, these recordings, they're just one piece of a very complicated story. They don't tell us everything.
Of course.
Of course. But still, it makes you think.
Yeah. It does. It really does. What if he had had those recordings at the trial? We'll never know for sure. But it's something Medina grapples with in this report, and it's something for all of us to think about. What does it really mean when someone says they were wrongfully convicted? How do we make sure our justice system is fair and transparent? There are no simple solutions here, are there?
Not at all. But Medina's story, it's a good reminder for all of us, you know? It tells us to ask questions, to be skeptical, to hold the people in power accountable, especially when it comes to something as important as justice.
It reminds us that justice, it's not some finish line you cross. It's a process, and sometimes that process is messy and imperfect, and maybe even heartbreaking at times. But Medina's case, no matter what you believe about what happened, it forces us to confront these tough realities. It tells us to have these conversations, to look at our own biases, and to fight for a system that truly lives up to its name, a system that delivers justice for everyone. That's our deep dive for today. We've laid out the information, looked at the arguments, and now it's up to you to form your own conclusions.